Welcome back. Panel is joining us from their remote locations. NBC News Capitol Hill correspondent Casey Hunt, Tim Alberta, chief political correspondent for Politico, and Helene Cooper, Pentagon correspondent for the New York Times. Welcome. I want to get started, and I want to let Jamel Bouie essentially get us started and read this excerpt that he wrote earlier this week. The reckoning that is toppling Confederate monuments and fueling the largest sustained protests in 50 years is also, I think, turning the voting public decidedly against the president. The killing of George Floyd, the racially disparate impact of the pandemic, and the violent police rioting against accountability have shown millions of Americans what the future may hold if we continue along this path of inequality, exclusion, and authoritarianism. Casey Hunt, are you seeing, are the actions we're watching on Capitol Hill sort of, in some ways, proof that Jamal's right about this?
Chuck, I mean, I think what you heard from Tim Scott at the beginning of the broadcast says everything you need to know about this. I mean, even at the beginning of this past week, there was a sense that Republicans weren't necessarily going to make significant policy moves beyond the data collection. And Tim Scott spoke to the ways in which data collection is important, but he also in that interview suggested that they are going to go beyond that in this. And, you know, you would not be seeing that reflected in what they are actually doing if they weren't seeing the exact kind of political movement that you just described here. I mean, the shift on this has been fast and deep. And, you know, if the lawmakers are already seeing it this quickly, I think that really tells you how significant it is. And, you know, I will also just say I think Republicans are pretty lucky that they have a leader in Tim Scott who brings so much credibility to this issue. And his measured approach, I think, has gone it's gone quite a long way in convincing his colleagues to start to make these changes.
Tim Alberta, you wrote about the phrase law and order and how it doesn't have the same meaning politically anymore on the right.
You know, Chuck, it doesn't. And obviously, you know, post-2012, Republicans began to have this conversation about how do we soften the image of the party? How do we expand our appeal into these non-traditional communities? And they talked a lot about immigration reform and some other issues, but they didn't talk really at all about this issue of, you know, systemic injustice and institutional racism and police disproportionately targeting and brutalizing the African American community. And that is a conversation that is now taking place inside the Republican Party in a way that was really unimaginable just a few years ago. And so I think regardless of the outcome this November, the writing is really clearly on the wall for a lot of these Republicans now. The polling is just remarkable. Frank Luntz spoke to it earlier this week. He said, you know, I've been doing this for 30 years. I've never seen public opinion move so quickly. Karl Rove spoke to it in my piece. There is sort of a clear line of delineation that the spring of 2020 represents for Republicans, and they recognize that regardless of what the president is saying or doing, that they need to address this issue moving forward in order to be competitive and in order to get a foot in the door with some of these communities.
And I guess, Helene, the question is whether the president, whether he can play a role that's constructive here or not. I want to play, first I want to play two excerpts from the president. One just this week to Fox News about Abe Lincoln. Take a listen.
I think I've done more for the black community than any other president. And let's take a pass on Abraham Lincoln because he did good, although it's always questionable. You know, in other words, the end result.
Well, we are free, Mr. President.
But we are
did
free.
Pretty well.
You understand what I mean?
Yeah, no,
so I'm going to take a pass on Abe, honest Abe, as we call him.
And Helene, before you respond, I want to also play, because I think one of the challenges for this president is that this has been a long history of having one view about race. Listen to this quote from 1989.
A well-educated black has a tremendous advantage over a well-educated white in terms of the job market. If I were starting off today, I would love to be a well-educated black because I really believe they do have an actual advantage today.
It's sort of a similar question I had to Tim Scott is you know, can the president, because of his history, even his sort of his recent instincts here, can he play a constructive role without sort of acknowledging views that he had in the past that no longer seem to be mainstream?
I have an easy answer for that. No, I don't see how President Trump can play any kind of constructive role in what's going on right now in this movement for change because of who he is. I mean, I wish you had the face palm emoji for when you were playing that tape of him on Fox News just now talking about Abraham Lincoln. That was insane. That's very Trump. I mean, he thinks he's always talking about how much he's done for the black community, but as you can see from his actions, and you can see from the actions of the administration, that's patently untrue. There's nobody in their right mind that can make that defense or even that case for President Trump. And when you look at what he did, for instance, I mean, I've been so focused this past week on the military and what's been going on between President Trump and the military. But when you look at what he did on Confederate bases, when he immediately slammed down Pentagon efforts to start talking, and they weren't even saying we're absolutely going to do it. They had started in such an anemic way. We're going to start a bipartisan commission to talk about changing these Confederate base names, and Trump shut that down immediately. And he infuriated his senior military officials who were just ready to throw their hands up in the air. So it's like the idea that this is the guy who's going to play a constructive role in this movement for change in the United States, I think is preposterous.
Tim Alberta, is the president misreading his own base? I think he instinctively assumes his base is going to rise up on this Confederate name change thing. I don't fully see it that way. Do you?
You know, it's at the margins, Chuck, as with everything else the president does. I think he has such a myopic focus on his base that he doesn't recognize that politics is a coalition business, and that a lot of the votes that helped get him across the finish line in 2016 were coming from wealthy, affluent, two-car garage suburbs where voters are not only turned off by his rhetoric around race, but specifically when you get to issues of the Confederate flag or when you get to these protests in NFL stadiums, these are voters who culturally have drifted further and further from these traditional Republican positions of orthodoxy. And now the president has a choice to make heading toward November. It's, do you begin to soften ever so slightly? Do you modulate some of your positions, understanding that you can't afford to bleed these suburban voters? Or do you continue to just sort of take this hardline position, believing that that's what rallies your base behind you? Obviously, the math is going to be very difficult for him if he does not do something to acknowledge the fact that he needs to vote. Well, speaking of math, we're about to put up a math problem here for President Trump in our next segment. In fact, when we come back, the changes in our political culture and political parties that could play a big role in November. Stick around. Hello from Washington, I'm Chuck Todd, and thanks for checking out the Meet the Press channel on YouTube. Click on the button down here to subscribe and click over here to watch the latest interviews, highlights, and other digital exclusives.